welcome back. I'm going to continue World War One today, so I'm back on the World War One slideshow. If you just go to slide 101, that's where I'm at. Americans go to Europe; they're called doughboys. There's different reasons for giving that name. Sorry, I keep having to burp. Um, some people say that because the American soldiers are so well fed, they're kind of a little pudgy, so they get called doughboys. Others say it's because the buttons on their uniform are kind of round. So, whatever reason, American soldiers are fresh, and despite their inexperience, their numbers tip the scales towards the Allied side. Wilson wants the American military to win the war because then he can go to Paris and dictate the peace. Um, a lot of famous Americans were in World War One. Harry Truman, a future president, future generals in World War II, MacArthur, Marshall, and Patton are all there. Eisenhower is around. So there's a lot of people that are involved. We'll hear more about later on. The main American general is John J. Pershing. He's the leader of the American Expeditionary Force. Right before the war, his family perished in a house fire, so he kind of has a tragic story right before World War One. He arrives in June of 1917 in France, and more soldiers come each month. There's a number of battles where the Americans play a significant role. I've got those listed on slide 104. I'm not going to go into all the military aspects, but basically the American military really tips the scale, not because they're necessarily better soldiers, and we don't quite know how to fight this new type of trench warfare. The last big war we fought was the Civil War. So it's been a while since we fought a huge war. So it takes the Americans a little time to get used to knowing what they're doing. There's a lot of heroes that come out of World War One. Alvin York is one of them. I've got just some facts about some of these heroes, so you can kind of read them, and I've got some video clips if you'd like to watch. But Alvin York is a big hero. Eugene Ballard, he receives the Croix de Guerre, which is the highest award in France. I believe it's the highest award. He mans a machine gun post during World War One during the Battle of Verdun. He actually went over and volunteered earlier than when America got in the war. Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts are two other kind of Americans that really perform heroic acts. They killed dozens of Germans on their own. They both received the Croix de Guerre. So a lot of individual heroism in World War One. Some Americans go over and form something called the Lafayette Escadrille. They're basically volunteer pilots. They're kind of the celebrities of the day. Back in the day, maybe the cowboy was kind of the iconic, you know, version of manliness, the frontiersman. Well, now in World War One, kind of pilots are kind of the symbol of manliness. But life expectancy is pretty short for them. These guys in the Lafayette Escadrille, they were crazy. Some of them would fly into battle and they would wear bathrobes. They go volunteer, so they're not really in the regular army, so they can get away with stuff like that. They have two pet lions that are their mascots. I forget the name of theirs, but they're just kind of crazy guys. Eddie Rickenbacker was a famous German American that goes over and becomes one of the greatest air fighters in World War One. A group of Indians go over and use their language, the Choctaw language, to confuse the Germans. So they play an important role. Blacks in World War One, a lot of black soldiers went over. The army is segregated, so black soldiers can't be with white units, and they usually have white officers, and they get treated pretty poorly in America. And then when they come over to Europe, they get treated really well, especially by the French. So it's kind of a sad thing that they got treated better by people in Europe than their fellow citizens, but that's kind of how it went. They have to raise money for their own equipment. They face a lot of discrimination. They have white officers. A lot of times they're used for labor, manual labor. They don't even get to do the fighting. There's a famous group called the Harlem Hellfighters. It was the African American 15th National Guard. I would watch that video on slide 111. It's pretty interesting. They have some great battles and they have a lot of great moments. The black leader W.E.B. Du Bois, he said, "Let us, while this war lasts, forget our special grievances and close our ranks, shoulder to shoulder with our white fellow citizens that are fighting for democracy. If this is our country, then it is our war." Um, so basically, a lot of blacks saw this as a chance to say, like, hey, we're just as American as everyone else. We'll prove it by fighting for the country. And they did, and they fought very bravely. Okay, in 1918, the Germans try one last attempt to win the war. Russia has been knocked out of the war. Russia goes communist. Lenin, the communist leader, does not want Russia involved in World War One. So in the spring of 1918, Russia withdraws from the war. So the Germans, they were fighting a two-front war, Russia and France. All those soldiers that were fighting against Russia can now be sent to the west, and Germany's goal is to defeat the Allies before the Americans show up. Well, they fail. They try to break the trench line. They do get close to Paris, and you have the Second Battle of the Marne, but basically they fall short. Excuse me, I cannot stop burping. I think I drank too much water. Basically, what happens is the Germans, they weren't defeated, okay? They just couldn't go on. They could still defend their homeland. Most of the war is fought on French soil, so the German country didn't even really experience the war except for the blockade. And there is starvation in Germany because England is cutting off Germany's food. So I don't want to say that Germany didn't experience the war. They just didn't have foreign armies on their soil. Wilson promises a just peace. He says to Germany, if you guys surrender, if you give up, I promise that the peace that is forced upon you will be a just peace. This was called Wilson's 14 points. If you look at slide 118, you can kind of see what they were. So basically, because they can't go on any longer and because of Wilson's promise of fairness, the Germans sign an armistice. They don't surrender, they don't sign a peace treaty, they sign an armistice, which just means they'll stop fighting. This armistice goes into effect on November 11th, 1918. If you look at slide 120, you can see what the terms of the armistice were. There's 7 I got there. There were some others, but those are the main ones. So basically, Germany has to give up a lot to get the Allies to stop fighting. And I should mention, once the Germans try their breakthrough and it fails, then the pendulum swings the other way and the Allies start to invade Germany. So kind of towards the end, German soil was starting to get invaded, and that's why they called for an armistice. And that's why Germany has to give up kind of their bargaining chip, and they agree to a lot of this stuff. The Kaiser abdicates. So Germany surrenders. There will be a peace treaty in 6 months. If you look at slide 123, if you click on that video and go to the 24-minute mark, there's a great scene. It shows soldiers celebrating once the war is over. German and American soldiers come together. They put on each other's hats. They trade food. The Germans get cigarettes from the Americans. There's all kinds of celebration. The Germans are overjoyed. They're also shocked that the war is over. They never knew how the war was going because the military censored any news going back into Germany. There's huge losses on each side. Countries lose millions of men. There's untold numbers wounded. There's psychological damage. If you look at slide 126, I got 2 YouTube clips there that talk about the psychological damage. This shows original footage of men shaking uncontrollably or going crazy. It's pretty graphic footage. It's not bloody, it's just graphic. It shows men's faces disfigured who survive. So if you want to watch that, you can kind of see how devastating the war was, even to those who lived. Okay, so the Paris Peace Conference takes place in 1919. This is a big deal. There's 20-some nations that go. The big 4 important people are David Lloyd George of England, Vittorio Orlando of Italy, George Clemenceau of France, and Woodrow Wilson of America. Wilson knows that America saved the Allies, so he wants to play a big role. The Treaty of Versailles is the main treaty we're going to focus on. Each treaty with each different country had a different name, but the Versailles Treaty is the most important one. Wilson wants a democratic peace with self-determination, meaning let people vote for their own country. He also wants a League of Nations to replace the alliance system that helped start the war. Europeans are more interested in balance of power and security. So Wilson comes over there. Wilson kind of tries to throw his weight around. The French are not impressed. I love this quote by George Clemenceau. It's on slide 137. He said, "God gave us the 10 Commandments and we broke them. Wilson gave us 14 points. We shall see." So some people think that Wilson's pretty arrogant. You know, he's given us all these rules to follow. Okay, so the Versailles Treaty gets signed. It's a very harsh peace towards Germany. You'll actually watch a video on the Paris Peace Conference. But if you look at slide 138, you can see all the things that Germany had to give up. I won't read them to you. Just kind of look at them, make a little note somewhere about them. So you kind of know the Versailles Treaty is very harsh towards the Germans. Germany has to give up a lot of its land. A lot of new countries are formed. So basically, after World War I, there's a lot of bitterness on the part of Germany. Now, the big thing in America is, should we be involved in the League of Nations? Part of Wilson's 14 points was he wants an international body that can settle disputes so we don't ever have a big war again. It was called the League of Nations. He gets the League of Nations approved in Europe. But anything that is a treaty has to be approved by the Senate. Well, the Senate is in the hands of the Republicans, and Henry Cabot Lodge is the leader of the Senate Republicans. So basically what happens is Wilson negotiates a peace, and he comes back to America, and the Republicans have to approve it. There's one problem with the League of Nations. There's something called Article 10. It says basically that if there's a war in Europe or if there's an act of aggression, the League of Nations members probably have to be the ones to deal with it. So basically, you could get a scenario where some country in Europe gets aggressive and the League of Nations will request that America send 100,000 troops to deal with it. Now, think about this. You're an American, you're a voting citizen, and we just got done fighting the biggest war in human history. And now Wilson says, I want to supply troops to Europe for the next time this happens. You're probably thinking, if this happens again, that's their problem. If they want to go through this bloodshed and madness again, let them do it. We are out of this. Most Americans don't want to have to go to Europe every time there's a squabble, because if you study American history, if you study European history, you'll know that basically that's all Europe's history is war after war after war. So basically, a lot of Americans oppose the League of Nations, not because they don't want to talk with the world, just because they don't want America to be a blank check for when Europe goes to war again. There's basically three groups of senators. There's irreconcilables. They're extreme isolationists. They don't want to support the League no matter what. There's reservationists, and Henry Cabot Lodge is one of these. He tells Wilson, if you get rid of Article 10 and make it so that we're not the policemen of the world, I think we will join the League of Nations. And then there's the internationalists like Wilson. Wilson allows no compromise for the League. He says, nope, you're going to take the League of Nations as it is, no changes. You either support it or vote against it. Wilson goes on a speaking tour of the country, basically trying to tell the American people, write a letter to your senator, send them a telegram. We have to join the League of Nations. It's vital. It will prevent the next war from happening. And if you think World War I was bad, World War II will be even more terrible. What ends up happening is he speaks too much. He has too strenuous of a schedule, and he gets sick. He comes back to Washington and has a stroke. So what ends up happening is for a few months, President Wilson can't do anything as president, and his wife basically acts as president. So some people like to say that Edith Bowling Galt, Edith Wilson, she was the first woman president of the United States. Basically, she keeps Wilson secluded. You know, he has a stroke, he can't move, and when people need something from the president, she'll go in and then she'll come back out and say this is what he said, or he signed this when she probably signed it. What ends up happening is the League of Nations gets defeated in the Senate. Um, uh, Wilson could have got the league passed if he would have changed just a little bit. But Wilson tells the Democrats, don't you vote for anything that Henry Cabot Lodge supports. So Henry Cabot Lodge actually has amendment or reservations to the treaties. He changes it a little bit, and it has the support of the Republicans. So the Republicans would have supported this version of the League of Nations, but Wilson tells the Democrats in the Senate to vote against it. So in a way, the Democrats actually killed the League of Nations. So the League of Nations does not have America. It does not have Russia because Russia is a communist nation and Europe is afraid of communism. There's no Germany in the League of Nations till 1926. And basically, as we kind of learn about the events leading up to World War II, we'll see how the League of Nations failed at every step to prevent World War II from happening. So America retreats back into isolationism. And we'll kind of see how we get dragged back into European affairs later on. Woodrow Wilson dies in 1924, kind of a bitter old man. And if you look at slide 158, I just kind of got the legacy of World War I. It makes the United States a potential global superpower. It impacts the economy. It makes America a rich nation. The government has unprecedented control over the economy. World War I created problems for decades to come. A lot of people argue that World War I caused a farm recession in the 20s, caused the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. It's a terrible time for civil liberties in America. And it kind of creates this foreign policy vision for America that still exists to this day, spreading democracy. And the last couple slides, if you want to read more about World War I, these are the books I would start with. John Keegan and Margaret Macmillan have the best books I think that are out there. But I would read The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman. I think that's my favorite book on World War I. Really does a great job of talking about the events leading up to the war. If you want a good book on the American home front, read David Kennedy's Over Here. And then the last slide, I've got a lot of documentaries. If you want to learn more about World War I, you could watch these, and you would learn so much about World War I. It would be amazing. So that's World War I. Now we'll move on to the 1920s.